Good morning, Representative Zahn. I am Meiling, and we are a team of high school volunteers from the Little Masters Club. Thank you for joining us today. This year marks the semi-quincentennial of the United States of America, and in the past 250 years, the Chinese American community have experienced a multitude of hardships, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. But we have also witnessed the growing civic engagement and representation of the Chinese Americans in the American society and politics in recent years. Therefore, we would like to conduct a series of interviews with Chinese American elected officials from Washington State to tell your stories and to inspire more young people to participate in civic engagement. We are very honored to have you as our first guest speaker. So let's begin.
You know, I immigrated to the United States when I was 10 from Hong Kong with my family. My uncle had come here for college, and then he sponsored us when he became a citizen and settled in this area.
Was that like the main reason why you guys chose Washington State as the location?
Yes, absolutely. You know, it was so important that we had the support as an immigrant family where we were sponsored by my uncle, because actually the year that we came was also the year that the Vietnamese refugees fled to the United States. So I went to school with families and fellow students that came with nothing. So I felt really fortunate that we had our uncle who, when we first came, we stayed in his basement before we were able to move into our own home. And that made a huge difference in settling into the United States and understanding the customs and just how to be an American. I think actually fundamentally the part that has made me successful is that I believe as immigrants we've had to adapt to a different country in a way that gives us some superpower that we might not even think about, of how do you problem solve, how do you pivot, how do you read a room, how do you figure out the nuance of what it's like to come to a different country that has different customs and adapt in a way that you can still be authentically yourself while you're able to be successful in the United States. And you started out with the 250 years in the United States, and I think so much about the fact that that is, as immigrants, our superpower is our ability to bring something new to the table that actually makes the country better. You know, when I was in middle school, the physics teacher from high school came down to the middle school and told us about the classes and how fun it was. And I think that was the start of my interest in going into engineering, because we didn't have anybody in my family that were engineers. And then myself and my two younger brothers became engineers. So my first degree was in civil engineering at the University of Washington. I went to work for a couple years for the Weyerhaeuser Company, and then I went back and got my master's in structural engineering. Then after I was a practicing engineer for a number of years, what I came to realize is that so much of the things that we deal with are grounded in public policy. So actually 20 years after I got my first master's in engineering, I went back to the Evans School at the University of Washington and got my Executive Masters of Public Administration. And I think that it's been a really good complement of degrees where I have both the technical engineering skills and problem solving, as well as the public policy side that is really nuanced, because it's really about how those policies impact everyday lives and how we look at the impact of our policy to people, whereas my engineering degree was much more about designing for the built environment, which is slightly different. You know, I really enjoyed college. I lived in the dorms at the University of Washington, and actually my third year in college, I became a resident advisor in the dorms. So what that meant was that I had 100 people that lived on those two floors that I was responsible for in terms of making sure their needs were being met. And I really enjoyed that, because I would say it was a really good complement to my engineering education, because that was so much about the nuts and bolts of statics, dynamics, strength of materials. And then the resident advisor role gave me a chance to really engage with people. And that's probably where my interests have always been, around how we intersect the people side of things, what we talk about of soft skills, as well as the hard science piece. And then I would say that what I've come to realize over time is that there were also challenges being a woman in the engineering field. In fact, I look back now and I realize how some of the very things we were taught in order to do well actually was more of a detriment to us. And what I mean by that is this. I remember taking a class right before I graduated about learning about the imposter syndrome. Have you heard about this? I'm glad you don't, because I don't wish that on anybody now. But the imposter syndrome was the idea that as a woman, as an engineer, that I was going to have this imposter syndrome where I would doubt myself and my ability to be an engineer. And so we just had to work through being an imposter, which is so wrong. And I look back now and I think about the fact that maybe there was a thinking that it was a way to help us acclimate to being one of the few engineers in the field. But I think in a lot of ways, when we do things like that, we're actually harming our ability to actually succeed without the idea that there's all of these things that are attached to us. I love the work. On Monday, I celebrated 22 years at the Port of Seattle. And when I first started there, I actually had a project that I was working on overseeing construction at the airport, and I started at 3 in the morning. And I was like the clerk of the works, whatever needed to be done. I had pivoted from being a designer into overseeing construction. And then over the years have worked my way up in responsibility. And so when the former chief engineer retired, I applied for the job and I got the role, and it's been a little over 3 years, and I love how I've been able to really bring the department together. We have just about 160 employees in the group, and how we actually help deliver projects for the Port of Seattle, which is a regional steward of the public's land, and how we actually look at growing our economy through the built environment. So I just love that work. Well, I would say that in 2016, my kids were getting older. I have 2 daughters. And so I signed up for this Leadership Tomorrow program. And there are 80 cohorts in this program. It runs about 9 months. And I joined that thinking that this was a great opportunity, as I have more time because my kids are older, to figure out where I want to volunteer more on some boards or commissions or nonprofit organizations. And yet it was that time where I was exposed to a lot of different people and needs in our community. And I came to realize that maybe instead of only being a staffer in government at the Port of Seattle, that I could actually do a lot of good with my knowledge, having worked in the private sector and in government, to step into political office. At that point, I had lived in Bellevue for over 20 years and really thought that this was a great opportunity to give back to the community by leaning into the policy side. So although we had no politicians in the family or in our friend group, I raised my hand and decided to run for office. No regrets. I think that this has been the most impactful way that I could give back to the community by actually serving in this role of being able to work on policies that make a difference. I would say several things. One of the things that I spend a lot of time doing is I like being out in community. I think actually this is how we met the Little Masters, is through being out in community. And one of the challenges I think that we have in local government is the fact that if we don't spend enough time in community, then the very policies that we're working on may not actually connect with the community. So And I would also say that most of the policies we're not doing on our own, right? We work as a team, as a council, along with leadership in the city of Bellevue. So some of the things I'm really proud of is that we've done a lot in terms of addressing transportation safety. So you've probably seen that we're lowering speed limits on some of our roads because we're seeing a lot of crashes and people being harmed. The great thing about Bellevue is that we are a majority minority city, and one of the great programs that we have is the Bellevue cross-cultural programming without walls. So even though we were not able to get funding to build a cross-cultural center, the fact that we are incorporating programs anyway throughout the city of how we bring different cultures together for joy, learning, and connection. I think that's one of the things that I'm really proud of. And then lastly, I would say that we've done a lot in the years that I was on the council, almost 7.5 years, in how we create more impetus and land use for housing that's more affordable, because I would love to see more of our young people be able to, when they graduate, come back and live in Bellevue. But right now, Bellevue is really expensive. And that's not the reality for most families, for their children that graduate from school and are able to come back. I mean, my daughter lives with me right now. I love the fact that she's with me, but at some point it would be good for her to be able to find something affordable to move out on her own. So. The state representative role is actually similar and different. Right, so we are still working on policy. What I love the most about it, though, is that so much of our policies are interconnected, like systems within systems. When I was on the Bellevue City Council, we did work on a number of different policy areas, right? Public safety, community safety, transportation, housing, water, sewer, picking up garbage and keeping the community clean. One of the things that it doesn't do, though, if we think really broadly about what the needs are in our community, is around healthcare and education, because we have the school districts that look at that. At the state level, we're actually able to have that bird's eye view of what are the different policies and how they're interconnected. So, for example, when we think about schools and the fact that we continue to struggle with adequately funding our schools, we also see that school enrollment have been dropping. What I believe is that if we continue to make sure that we're able to build housing that is more affordable, then more families are able to live in Bellevue and the other cities in the 41st, so that our schools will continue to have a continual enrollment of students. What I hear a lot is that when people living in Bellevue have families, sometimes they look around and think, well, we need to move to another city that's more affordable, because when so much of your income goes to housing, you don't have a lot left to be able to pay for the other things that are also important. So I would say that that's one example. I also would say that I didn't realize it at the time, but when I got into Olympia in January of last year as an appointee, that I am the only practicing engineer in Olympia with 147 legislators. And I do think that having that additional voice of my experience of understanding delivering projects, design and construction, and how to do that in a public setting with government makes a difference, because we spend billions of dollars in our capital delivery and construction, and being able to bring that voice to Olympia and complement my colleagues, I think has made a difference. I would say that one of the bills that I have not yet passed that I intend to pass is one related to the safe system approach. And what that requires is our Department of Transportation to work directly with cities so that as they're designing the transportation projects, that we're really thinking about safety in mind, of how we actually design in a way that is more integrated, so that between cars, pedestrians, bicycles, that we're able to design a little more thoughtfully by having really deep coordination, because we know that we still see a lot of crashes on our roads. And in fact, the more that I think about our health, being able to walk and bike to school for kids safely is really important. So how do we think about doing that? One of the bills that I worked on this year was related to electric motorcycles. So we were hearing from the community that there are challenges with 12 and 13-year-olds getting these electric bicycles that can go up to 30 or more miles per hour. They're not licensed. They don't have to get any training. Most of them are not wearing any helmets. So that bill actually is going to have a work group looking at what is the right policy we should be putting in place to make sure that as we see these newer vehicles on our roads, what are the right safeguards that should be put in place. So that's one of them. Another one that I'm going to continue to work on with housing is modernizing our Housing Finance Commission. That was a bill that got really close to moving out of the House this year. And we need to do more, because as we look at housing, we know that cities can't do that alone. Developers aren't going to be able to do that alone. So what's the state's role in doing that as well? And then I would say that the third one I am leaning into is related to education. I'm on the Equity and Education Committee. I was on it last year as well. And we really have to think differently about how our education funding works, and making sure that the very way that we teach as well and how we fund better reflects student needs, instead of the prototypical model that says you get so much money based on how many kids that you have versus what the kiddos really need in order to succeed in schools. I would say that life is full of challenges. I don't even think about that very much from the standpoint of them necessarily being challenges, maybe because as an engineer, I'm programmed for problem solving, and in fact, sometimes I can be irritating to people because I am constantly, as I'm interacting with people, thinking about is that a problem we should be solving? What can we do about it? And digging into those conversations. And I do think that sometimes it can be challenging to think about all the problems that we have in the world versus what can we, in whatever space that we're in, take action on to make that particular thing better. And also recognizing that at times, if that's the reality that we have to work in, then what are the things we can still do that's within our sphere of influence and control? And I would say that we also have to figure out what our own self-care looks like. I don't actually think I have one with me today. But a few years ago, as part of my own self-care, because my husband and I, we like to go walk on the beach at low tide and we pick up rocks. So during COVID, we actually started to polish our rocks out in the little shed. And then I would give the rocks away. I would also, when I was going to a really stressful meeting, I would carry a rock in my pocket. And I just felt like that was a thing that helped me be grounded in, staying in the moment, staying calm, it's okay. And so whatever that is for other people, find that, because I think that we are always going to run into various obstacles, challenges, but our ability to stay in the moment and be present and then be able to respond, I think makes a huge difference. I would say my biggest advice would be stay really curious. When I think about my career, and if somebody would have said to me when I was 15 that you're going to be the chief engineer and be a state representative, I would have thought, who are you talking about? Not me. And yet along the way, I think I've stayed really curious about the learning and saying yes to different opportunities that come along. Because I would say that when I was in high school, there were not a lot of girls that were in the science classes, but I really thought that was really fun. I really loved that. And then when I was in college, there were very few, I think it might also be the only engineer that was a resident advisor, because most of the time the resident advisors tended to be students that were in social work, psychology, the people careers. I just thought it would be fun, and I decided to try it. I didn't get in the first time, but the second year that I applied, they accepted me to be a resident advisor. And then pivoting from, design into construction, and saying yes when there was an assignment that they needed somebody to go work at the airport starting at 3 in the morning. And I thought, well, why not me? I've never done it before. It will make me a better engineer. At the end of that project, what I just realized instead is actually I really love the energy of construction and how all the teams come together to solve problems. And I think that's the same sentiment I bring to the legislature, is that together we can figure this out, right? Who are the others that we can bring into the room? So I guess ultimately what I'm saying to you is stay curious, look at who else should be talking with you about the possibilities or the problem solving, and don't be afraid to say that I don't know the answer to that. Who else can I talk to? And I would say lastly, you don't have to wait to get civically engaged. I didn't decide to run for office until I was in my 50s. You don't have to wait that long. There's lots of different ways to engage, and so find what you might be passionate about and check it out. And if you find that, that wasn't really quite what I'm interested in, pick something else, because you never know what you might actually get really excited about unless you try different things and talk to people. And just get out of your comfort zone, because life is really interesting. It's just sharing about the fact that when I came to the United States when I was 10, it was all about assimilation and acclimation. So be as an American as possible, right? Don't bring your food to school because it looks funny, it smells funny. And we wouldn't necessarily have celebration for Chinese New Year, Lunar New Year, that nowadays it's part of the norm that we're bringing our whole selves, including our culture. In fact, one time I was thinking about the fact that, maybe when I was growing up in the United States, coming in to middle school as an immigrant, that we were kind of like this melting pot, this stew where everything kind of gets mushed together. And now I think about us more like the stir fry, where you actually want the flavors to come out of all of the ingredients, and how much better it is. And that's probably why when you ask me about, what I'm the most proud of, that the cross-cultural programming really came in, because it is not about any one of us expected just to be absorbed within whatever the culture is, but really about how we lift up and we share in a way that's a celebration of our culture. Because certainly we can get locked into the challenges that we have, which we still see challenges. We saw challenges when we had COVID, and some of the rhetoric that was happening around the Chinese community. And yet we have to push past that, so that what we're talking about is that we all belong here. And how do we show up in a way that allows us to be here and be our authentic selves? So yeah, I was kind of thinking about that too, of how things have changed over time in a really good way, even though underlying it, there's still some issues that happen.